Hi, everybody. It's Big Cheds. We're picking up where we stopped off last time. We're doing bumps in the road. This is My Battles with Cancer, a patient and caregiver's candid memoir. I was a cancer patient and a caregiver. And when I was first diagnosed, I said, I'm going to beat this cancer. And when I do, I want to publish a book to help other people and talk about what I went through. And I published that in 2020. Since that, I went and published two more books, Trading Wisdom and Trading Quotes. And then I went back, I rewrote My Battles with Cancer. You can see here this version 2. I updated it. And then I actually recorded the audiobook. That took me about 10 months. It's available on Audible right now. But I want the book to be free to anybody who wants it. So that's what this is. It's part of that series. I'm, of course, Big Cheds on Twitter, and I'm Cheds Trading on YouTube. You're here right now on YouTube, so I'm Cheds Trading. So Bumps in the Road is where we left off last time. We talked, the last one was the first cycle of chemotherapy and talking about recovering from chemotherapy and what that's like. So here we are, Bumps in the Road. And just to kind of catch you up, I said last time, based on my early results, it was easy to think that I would keep all my hair, even though, all the chemotherapy drugs I was taking, made you lose your hair. So here we are, Bumps in the Road. Tuesday. The oncologist told us to monitor my temperature closely while I was at home, and if it ever rose above 100.4, I was to call his office day or night without delay. He explained that chemotherapy affected my immune system and it was compromised. So even a simple illness could do serious and potentially fatal damage to me. He emphasized that a fever would be an early sign of trouble, and therefore it was extremely important for me to diligently monitor my temperature. With that clear and present danger in mind, I kept 2 thermometers within arm's length at all times, just in case one of them was not working properly. My temperature started to rise during Tuesday afternoon of the first chemotherapy cycle's 3rd week. I responded by putting a cold compress on my forehead and trying to take a nap. My goal was to relax my body and lower my heart rate, and as a result, hopefully lower my temperature as well. I was comfortable and in my zone, and the last thing I wanted was to be sent to the ER with a stupid fever. Home was where I needed to be so I could recover, and by no means did I want to return to the hospital unless it was absolutely necessary. After a few hours of resting, my temperature had still not come down at all, and even though I was feeling relatively fine otherwise, I decided to call the doctor just to be on the safe side. The nurse practitioner answered the phone and reviewed my symptoms. Most importantly, that my temperature was above that magic number. After a few more questions, the nurse decided that I should head into the ER out of an abundance of caution. This medical professional didn't seem alarmed at all when we spoke on the phone, so I just figured that heading into the hospital was a formality. Surely I would be returning home soon thereafter, and this is no big deal, right? On the way to the hospital, I sent this update to my Twitter followers. Quote, heading to the emergency room out of an abundance of caution. Temperature too high, and I probably have a virus. December 19th, 2017, at Big Cheds. My wife and I drove to the hospital where she dropped me off so I could go check in, and I calmly went over my symptoms with the admitting staff and explained why the nurse practitioner had sent me there in the first place. Once I was processed for intake, another nurse took my vital signs and asked me a bunch of questions about my health. After they confirmed that my temperature was over 100.4 degrees, I was told to wait until they could find a room and perform some more additional tests. After the hospital staff had finally found me a room, the doctor on call ordered a series of tests to figure out what was actually going on. He was worried that my immune system might be compromised. At this point, I was still thinking that it was silly for me to be there. Even though my temperature was over that magic number, other than a lack of energy, I was actually feeling pretty good. The first test they performed was a blood test, and I sat patiently and watched as the nurse inserted that silver needle to capture 4 vials of blood. Then they did a nasal swab to look for flu, took a urine sample to look for infection, and performed an x ray to look for signs of pneumonia. After completing this rigorous testing routine, all I could do was sit with my wife and wait for those results to trickle in. Honestly, I was a little bit scared, but I was also confident that I would be just fine in the end. I still thought that it was a bit of overkill to run that many tests on me. The blood test results came back, and after an hour, the doctor delivered the bad news. I was neutropenic. According to Wikipedia, neutropenia is an abnormally low concentration of neutrophils in the blood. Neutrophils make up the majority of circulating white blood cells, and they serve as the primary defense against infections by destroying bacteria, bacterial fragments, and immunoglobulin-bound viruses in the blood. The bottom line was that my body was vulnerable. If I were to catch any sort of illness, I would not be able to fight it off the same way a healthy person could. A common cold or virus could easily be fatal for me. Wanting to know more, I asked the doctor, and he told us about something called ANC, or absolute neutrophil count. According to Wikipedia, absolute neutrophil count is a measure of the number of neutrophil granulocytes, also polymorphonuclear cells, present in the blood. Neutrophils are a type of white blood cell that fights against infection. More or less, because of this stupid ANC thing, I was not going home anytime soon. The hospital had a strict rule that in order for a patient to get discharged, that ANC number had to be over a certain level. So going forward, that was the only thing that mattered. Wednesday. After keeping my Twitter friends up to date throughout the ordeal, I sent them a message after I received the bad news. Feeling especially low, I really needed some encouragement, and they sure delivered. Pardon me. Admitted overnight. Quote from Big Cheds. Admitted overnight, and now it looks like I'll be here for a few days, waiting for the blood counts to improve. Neutropenia. December 20th, 2017 at Big Cheds. Here are some of the responses from my followers. Prayers sent your way, man, at Golden Thumb. Hang in there, bud. Prayers for your health. Len Robinson. Stay strong, brother, at Mad Stacker. Get better, Cheds, at Manny83. Trust in your doctors, but we'll send the positive vibes your way, at Andy. Pulling for you to get better soon. Try not to watch the market too much, at Pinky Trader. The doctor on call consulted with my medical oncologist, and they both agreed that I should be admitted overnight to the main hospital so they could observe me. A request was put in to try to find me a room, but I was warned that the hospital was overbooked. They were clear that I might not be transferred until the next morning. As you can understand, my spirits were dire. I was feeling weak, broken, and I was frustrated that this had happened. I was badly yearning to be back at home safely, watching TV or playing video games. And I also felt a sense of shame that I had found myself in that position, believing that I probably could have avoided the whole ordeal somehow if I had just been more careful. This type of thinking was an attempt to claim control over my situation because if I could blame myself, that meant that I was also capable of fixing it. More or less, I was at an emotional low point. Still, I was able to keep falling into an even deeper hole due to the strength and support of my wife. She didn't care that it was late in the night and she had to work the next day. She was going to be with me and do whatever she could to help me feel better, and that was wonderful. After the medical staff determined that I was neutropenic, my temporary room had to be sealed off from the rest of the emergency room. Despite this dark moment, I was still able to find a silver lining and some sense of relief. Even though I was sick and vulnerable, I knew that I was in the care of some excellent medical professionals, and they were going to make sure nothing else happened to me. Having confidence that I was not going to die in that moment helped me from feeling even more sorry about my situation. And that allowed me to surrender control over my destiny to the medical professionals taking care of me. By now, it was just past midnight, and the emergency room was absolutely packed. There were patients stuffed into every available space, like sardines in a can. These injured individuals were in the hallways, lying on stretchers, sitting in chairs, outside of examination rooms, and everywhere in between. To my eyes, the medical staff was in an absolute frenzy, with nurses and doctors busily trying to triage all the chaos. At some point while we were waiting for my overnight hospital room, I had to go take a bathroom break. And along the way to the bathroom, I could hear many cries for help from the other patients who were in pain. This was a chaotic environment, and there really was a lot for me to take in. As I walked, I tried to study these other patients to get a sense of what they were going through, and I was again drawn away from my own misfortune, if only for a little bit. There was a beer-bellied man laboring to catch his breath as his wife held his hand tightly. Both of their faces were beet red and swollen from crying, and he was in obvious discomfort. I was also drawn to a tall and slender man with thick matted hair who looked fragile and deathly pale while he was hooked up to an oxygen machine. Seeing these people really helped me to count my blessings. I was thankful that I was not in the same boat as these other folks I saw suffering on my stroll to the bathroom. Even though I had cancer, I was thankful I was not in the same boat as these folks. This strange experience made me wonder what the stories were of all these suffering people, and I wondered how had they ended up with me on this crazy night. Seeing all those people and the madness of the hospital staff trying to manage them cemented an even higher level of respect I had for the nurses and doctors that work in the emergency room. And I knew for sure that I could never work in a place like that. As someone who is highly empathic, I would likely suffer from emotional overload. It must be incredibly difficult for the staff to come in every day and deal with that type of suffering, and I really respect the fact that they can do it. After a few more hours of waiting, they were finally able to find me a room in the main hospital. The ER doctor explained that I was going to be transferred to a floor reserved exclusively for cancer patients. And presumably, it was set up this way to make it easier for the doctors and nurses to treat patients with somewhat similar needs. And I was comforted by that thought. I was whisked away in a wheelchair by a pleasant-seeming man with a Haitian accent and a hint of a mustache. That day, he was training a new hire, a young man probably 20 years his junior. As we made our way, the junior watched intently as the elder explained the proper procedure for moving a patient from one part of the hospital to another. Eventually, we arrived at the new floor, and as they pushed me out of the elevator and wheeled me down the hallway towards my new room, I noticed that something was quite different. Moments ago, I was in a chaotic emergency room, and this was a quiet and peaceful place. There were no more than a dozen rooms, watched over by a small staff of nurses and orderlies. The fact that it was so quiet was a wonderful relief, as I had been experiencing sensory overload in the emergency room. When they wheeled me into my new room, it was as if I were entering a new world, one that was much softer and gentler than where I had come from before. This new chamber was also much larger, with plenty of space for both visitors and belongings. I also noticed that it had a private bathroom equipped with a shower, toilet, and vanity, and cleaning up and getting more comfortable seemed like a pretty good idea, so I looked forward to that. Next to the bed, there was a shamrock green recliner and ottomans for guests to sit on or sleep on while visiting. And I noticed that the TV was mounted on the opposite wall from the recliner, so I planned to spend my time there rather than in that clunky hospital bed. In addition, there were several large windows that covered most of the outside wall, and this open view allowed me to see far out into the distance, and that was pretty cool. At this point, it was early morning, and set before me, the sun was rising, greeting all the people living their normal lives across the city. Those wonderful beams of light also greeted me while I was stuck in the hospital with neutropenia. But at least I had a nice view. Considering everything that was going on, I was still feeling pretty good, and I thought that I would be out of the hospital in maybe a day or two. And even though there was just 6 days left before Christmas, I was incredibly confident that I would be released in time to avoid spending such an important holiday in the hospital. And given the comfort of my room, I didn't mind spending a day or two there, but by no means was I prepared to spend a whole week and miss Christmas. Definitely not. As I looked towards the window from my hospital bed, I saw a faint reflection of my face. What made me proud was the fact that I still had my hair, and that it was so long I could pull it back into a ponytail. The length of my hair had been a major point of pride for me, and lately, before having cancer, I let it grow long for the first time in my life. However, in the days leading up to my hospital admission, I'd started noticing small bits of it falling out. Since most of my hair was still there, though, I had been holding on to the hope that I might be able to keep it while undergoing chemotherapy. As the day went on and I continued to settle into my new room, I started shedding my hair everywhere. Each time I got up to go to the bathroom or stretch my legs, I found endless strands of hair on the bed and pillow. That was absolutely demoralizing. Every piece of hair I found laying there symbolized a piece of me dying, slowly and methodically. When I realized that I would lose all my hair, that was a big moment. I had to face the fact that I was fighting an uphill battle, and I should probably lower my expectations about avoiding the worst of the chemotherapy side effects. Up against a voracious tidal wave in the form of R-CHOP chemotherapy, I would not be spared from the force of that tidal wave crashing upon me. And even though I had almost completely neutralized my nausea so far using THC and CBD, I could not prevent my precious hair from falling out. By no means did I want to be one of those weird, bald, pale people with a bandana and face mask. I just wanted to be a normal guy and to do normal things like running my hands through my hair and giving my daughter a hug. That kind of life seemed far out of reach in that moment while I was stuck in the hospital with my hair falling out. Excuse me. Another thing that was weighing on my mood was having to take antibiotics twice a day. I was given this medicine as a precaution while they tried to identify what was actually wrong with me. It took 6 hours for each dose to be administered through an IV drip, and once it was started, I was tethered and stuck to that machine. I didn't mind being in this rather comfortable hospital room while I was recovering, but I wanted the freedom of being able to move around. And when I was connected to that IV machine, it made that all more difficult. It was also incredibly challenging to fall asleep while I was connected, a fact not helped by the nursing staff waking me up every few hours to take my vital signs. To try to stay sane, I had to remind myself that there was nothing I could do except complain, and so I tried my best to let go of the frustration. When I was unable to rest, I did my best to stay distracted from those troubles by playing games on my iPad and surfing the web, and doing some work on my iPad when I could. All throughout my hospital stay, I tried my best to keep an eye on the price charts, and I sent out messages to my Twitter followers when I discovered something of value, something interesting to share. During this harrowing experience, it was vitally important for me to have a reliable distraction like work, because otherwise I would have likely gone mad just thinking about how difficult and uncertain my life was. I badly needed something substantial to focus on, and interacting with people through my Twitter account really helped with that. And that made me feel more like a normal guy. Considering that I was stuck in the hospital and hooked up to an IV machine, I was rather proud of my ability to still churn out good information to my followers. But perhaps more important than that, I greatly enjoyed the back and forth I had with them. I also started working in earnest on a comprehensive beginner's guide to trading for my learning blog. What drove me was knowing that that guide could help a lot of people and could also provide me with a great escape from my troubles. Thursday. One thing that actually I loved about being stuck in the hospital was the room service. I was able to order 3 square meals a day, and there were a wide variety of options to choose from. By the second or third meal, I had figured out how I could order as much food as I could without going over my per meal limit. That little trick gave me a sense of satisfaction. When everything is out of control, the little things you can control make all the difference in the world. By ordering exactly what I wanted and having it delivered to me, I was temporarily in charge of my environment and experience. And in that moment, I was just another normal guy having a meal delivered to him instead of a sick patient stuck in the hospital eating Jello and saltine crackers. By the second day in my new room, I was still feeling pretty good, and my temperature had returned to normal, which suggested to me that I was on the road to recovery. Emotionally, it was still difficult, with feelings of isolation and frustration growing by the minute as my hair continued to fall out. Since my ANC, or absolute neutrophil count, from that morning's blood test had not improved enough yet, the doctors decided I needed to stay for at least 2 more days. Now, with just 4 days left until Christmas, the idea of being stuck there for the holiday made me insufferable. It's one thing to have cancer and be sick and vulnerable all the time, but spending Christmas in the hospital? That would be a whole new level of misery. Feeling lost and angry, I tweeted out to my followers hoping to receive some encouragement. Quote, I've always wanted to see what it's like to spend Christmas in the hospital, hooked up to the tubes. December 21st, 2017 at Big Cheds. As usual, I received so many messages of support. For example, stay strong, bro. Wishing you the best. At B King Capital. Positive vibes to you. 5-time survivor here. Remember, attitude is everything. 5 times. Wow. Best wishes for you, Mark Moon. Stay strong at Lee D. And folks, thank you so much. As always, I appreciate it. At some point during the afternoon, my sister came by to visit me, but once she found out that I was neutropenic, she couldn't spend any time with me. As a physician herself, she simply could not risk catching an infection from me if I had one, as that would impair her ability to do her job and see patients. Nor could she risk giving me an infection, as my immune system was highly compromised. Sorry about that. A little bit dry-throated here. Realizing that she would be unable to visit me made things even worse. It felt as if I were looking out through a glass door at someone incredibly important to me. And that experience further reinforced my feelings of isolation and detachment from others, as well as being a flawed and dangerously sick cancer patient. My sister had always been a big inspiration to me, and not being able to talk to her was discouraging, to be sure. Sorry, folks. As you know, I record this straight through. So while I was confined to my hospital room, and for the most part just laying in bed, one of the things the doctors and nurses were afraid of happening to me was something called neuropathy. Neuropathy is a condition of weakness, numbness, and pain from nerve damage, usually in the hands or feet. Neuropathy was one of the side effects of the chemotherapy drugs I was taking, and by not moving around as much, I was at increased risk. Thankfully, I had not experienced any neuropathy yet because I had pushed myself to remain as physically active as possible while I recovered. Towards the end of the second week of my chemotherapy recovery cycle, I even had enough energy to get out of bed and do some basic cardio exercises. And as my strength permitted, I even took short walks around the neighborhood. Needing some exercise that day, I decided to venture out of my room and to explore the rest of the hospital. It was a great feeling to leave that room, having been inside for more than 24 hours. As I walked down the hallway, I took a peek at some of the other patients' rooms, and I wondered to myself what type of cancer they had. For some reason, I wanted to know how serious their prognosis was so I could compare it to mine. Did they have as good a chance to win their battle as I felt I did? Did they have as strong a support network and access to powerful medicines like CBD and THC the way I did? Looking at these other folks, I counted my blessings, knowing that I was most likely more fortunate than the average person facing my disease. One foot in front of the other, I took note of the many visitors I passed as well, searching their faces to try to imagine what they were going through. I wanted to learn something from these other patients and visitors about how they were coping with their disease, and that might help me prepare for my battle. Cancer not only affects the patient, but also friends and family as well. And it can be just as difficult emotionally for them as it is for the patient. This was something I always kept in mind throughout my treatment process. That way I could stay, I could not, that way it would keep me from focusing solely on my own misfortune. Upon returning to my room, I felt a little bit refreshed and I settled back into the hospital bed to watch some television. Later that night, as I was starting to drift off to sleep, the nurse came in to set me up with a new antibiotic IV drip. It was important for them to keep me on those antibiotics, despite the fact that the early results from my blood cultures showed no bacterial growth. The nursing staff took blood cultures or samples during my first night in the emergency room, and over the course of 2 or 3 days, those tests of those samples would show if I had a bacterial infection. While we were waiting to see if bacteria were growing, I had to stay on the antibiotics just to be safe. The drip lasted for 6 hours, and during that time, it was incredibly difficult to fall asleep, regardless of my fatigue level. Once the nurse started the drip, I looked up at the clock and I told myself 6 hours later or by 8 o'clock in the morning, it would be finished, and then I could get some rest. When the clock finally turned to 8 o'clock, I pressed that help button on the hospital bed remote, and a different nurse came in to unplug me from the IV machine. To my absolute dismay and horror, I learned that the prior nurse had forgotten to start the drip. She had connected it, but actually never turned it on, never turned the IV machine on. So the prior 6 hours had been wasted. The idea of being connected to this machine for another 6 hours made me absolutely livid. But the worst part was there was literally nothing I could do about it. This was an extremely low point for me, as I was already dejected from seeing my hair falling out and feeling trapped in the hospital. Being unable to get any sleep just made things worse. Friday, by day 4 of my hospital stay, I was desperate to get some rest. I badly wanted to wake up recentered and ready to deal with a challenging situation. Despite my lack of sleep, I still tried my best to manage my frustration, but each day I was getting closer to the end of my rope. At this point, I had been in the hospital now for much longer than anyone had initially anticipated, and my feelings of isolation were overwhelming. There were so many frustrating aspects to my hospital stay. Not that long after the debacle with the antibiotic IV drip, I encountered an issue with having my blood drawn as well. When I was first admitted to the hospital and I went through that patient registration process, I was approached by a research assistant, and she explained that there were several ongoing research projects designed to improve the quality of patient care. I was more than happy to join a study, as I was extremely grateful for all the work being done by the medical researchers around the world. And for the most part, my participation just meant allowing them access to my already banked medical data, as well as letting them draw some extra blood each time I was tested. That morning, a new batch of nursing staff came in to take my vital signs and to draw blood to see how my immune system was doing. And then, each morning, the doctor ran those same tests to see if my absolute neutrophil count had recovered enough for them to send me home. And then I would wait for the results. Around lunchtime that morning, or that day, a nurse with emerald green eyes showed up to take my blood. When I asked her why she was attempting to take my blood again, she told me that she was from the research study that I had agreed to participate in. I told her that was true, but I reminded her that they were supposed to coordinate with the nursing staff on when to take the blood. There's a big difference between letting them draw an extra vial while the needle is already in your arm versus getting pricked a second time. And under normal circumstances, I don't think I would have cared that much about the mistake, but I was at my wit's end. And what made it more frustrating was there was literally nothing I could do, and I just felt guilty about complaining since it was for a good cause. Saturday, on the morning of day five of my hospital adventure, I eagerly awaited the results of my blood test, just as I had each day prior. This day, I was hoping against hope that they could send me home. Christmas was now just 2 days away, and I absolutely did not want to spend this or any holiday in the hospital connected to an IV drip. After breakfast, a nurse came in to take my vital signs, and I asked her to check the computer to see if my blood test results were back yet. After looking around for my information, she told me that my blood count had not improved. Worse than that, she told me that my blood count was headed in the wrong direction. This news left me completely demoralized. Once the nurse left the room, I called my wife to let her know that I would be staying for at least another day. She comforted me, coaching patience and reminding me that the hospital was the right place for me to be while I was vulnerable. She emphasized that I had a dangerous illness and that it was important for me to stay where I had the best chance to heal. Those words helped me to gain some perspective, and her calm demeanor was just what I needed in a difficult time. An hour later, the doctor on call, a broad-shouldered man with sharp features, walked into the room. He wanted to discuss the blood test results, and I cut him off before he could even start talking. Frantically, I said, I know, the blood counts went down, and I'm going to be here for another day. As I rambled on in a fit of frustration, he interrupted me and stated that, in fact, my blood counts had gone up. I was actually going home. A feeling of triumph, relief, and elation washed over me, as it would for a defendant who had just received a not guilty verdict in the trial of their life. It turned out that the first nurse had misread my results, and all my complaining was in vain. The bottom line, I was free as a bird, no longer sentenced to confinement. After nearly 4 full days in the hospital and coming rather close to a mental breakdown, I mean really close to a mental breakdown, the idea of closing this chapter was quite exciting. I could not believe that it was still my first cycle of chemotherapy, given how much I had been through. In that moment, as I was receiving the discharge news, I questioned if I was really going to make it all the way to the finish line. To get through just one cycle of treatment had already taken a significant toll on me, and I was not sure I could survive that process 5 more times. As soon as we got home from the hospital, my wife went into the bathroom and grabbed my hair clippers and a fresh razor. After suffering through days of finding hair clumps on my hospital bed and pillow, I was ready to take back some control by shaving my head. That was before the rest of my hair had a chance to fall out. With my daughter holding the phone to record the whole affair, my wife slowly and methodically made her way across my head with the clippers. After that initial clearing, she used a razor to shave off the remaining stubble. And though I was already missing the ability to run my hands through my hair, I had at least taken some control back from the cancer, and that made me feel better. The last 2 days before the Christmas holiday came and went as smoothly as could be expected, given my medical condition. Opting to keep things simple that year, we rested rather than driving out of state to visit friends and family as we normally would. Scheduled for my second chemotherapy session the day after Christmas, the joys of the holiday came and went rather quickly, knowing that I would soon be ejected with those poisons again. Extremely moody and short on empathy, I was not much fun to be around during that time. Towards the end of the holiday, I even started to snap at people, which is very much out of character for me. As the hour of my treatment neared, I sat in my computer chair and stewed, thinking about driving into the city to sit for several hours while they pumped me full of chemicals was not fun. Even as I was emotionally compromised, I tried to remind myself that I would be one cycle closer to being done, so I should just keep on pushing. As we drove into the city that following morning, part of me was hoping that they would have to postpone my second chemotherapy session after reviewing my blood test. In my mind, it was a reasonable possibility, given that I had just spent several days in the hospital with a virus. When I met with the doctor that morning after my blood tests, I discovered that unfortunately I was strong enough to receive the next treatment. Despite my recent perilous hospital stay, my medical oncologist believed that it was important to push forward so we would not lose any time in the fight against this aggressive lymphoma. My wife and I certainly did not want to protest or question the wisdom of the doctor, so we thanked him and checked in at the infusion area for my appointment. Once my name was called, I was led back to a small patient room and I got comfortable rather quickly. A lot of the mystique and feelings of fear I had before my first chemotherapy session were now gone. This time, I felt that I was as prepared as I could be, knowing more or less what to expect. I mercifully, this treatment would be, let me start again. Also, mercifully, this treatment would be 3 hours shorter than it had been the last time, as the nurses were able to give me the full dose of rituximab right away. On this day, I had the same nurse as before, and that was a bonus, as I had felt comfortable with her. I trusted in her ability to take care of me if something went wrong. After several episodes of Judge Judy and some video game time on my iPad, the session was over, and we thanked the nurse before driving home to begin another 3-week cycle of recovery. 4 days later, after that tough day 3 nausea period, I was lucky enough to have an appetite, so I ordered some Chinese food from the place down the street. My craving for those flavors was intense, but greater than my craving was nervousness about going out in public and interacting with other people. The thought of touching a door handle or in some way encountering the germs of a random person frightened me to no end. Despite this fear, I was determined to satisfy my needs, so I took precautions. This meant putting on long pants, a long shirt, and wearing a surgical mask. When I approached the restaurant's front door, I made sure to open it using the end of my shirt so my skin did not make contact with the door handle. Standing at the counter and waiting for my food with a face mask felt really strange, as I would normally smile at the staff, but I was unable to do so. I just stood there like a tree, waiting for my order. When they handed me that large chicken combo platter, I was elated. I salivated, imagining laying in bed and stuffing my face and erasing the feeling of those chemotherapy drugs running through my veins. One rule of thumb that served me well during treatment was, when you have an appetite, go for it. Eat as much as you can. Take advantage of the moment because you never know when you'll have an appetite again. Quote, finally got a good appetite 4 days after chemo, and I just demolished my Chinese food takeout. December 30th, 2017 at Big Cheds. For New Year's Eve, my wife's friend was hosting the annual party. Normally, over 100 people would attend this event, and that made for a fun and chaotic atmosphere. Thinking about attending this year's party terrified me, as I was used to a quiet and controlled environment at home. Concerns aside, I agreed to go to the event as it was important to my wife. Despite my condition, I was looking forward to seeing her friends and putting on a good face. Spending time with those people seemed like much more fun than being home and playing video games over and over again for the holiday. Furthermore, I recently shaved my head and I was curious to see how they would react to seeing my newly polished dome. It was psychologically critical to get out of the house and mingle, even though I was not at my best, as I had spent most of the last few weeks alone. Balancing my need for social contact with my fear of being in a tight space with a large group of people would be challenging, but it would be worth the effort. First and foremost, I was worried about sharing airspace with that many children, as any one of them could be carrying an illness. In order to protect myself as much as possible during this excursion, I opted to wear a surgical mask and plastic gloves. I also planned to avoid making any physical contact with the guests, including my wife's friends, who I would normally hug when I saw them. Greeting people through a surgical mask and timidly waving at them through my plastic glove covered hand felt a little bit silly, but it was still nice to see those folks. After all, they were my friends too, and not just my wife's friends. Adding weight to the moment, I knew that they were worried about me, and so I wanted to show them that I was doing just fine. After those brief hellos and some small talk, I went upstairs into one of the bedrooms to relax for a while. I was safe and sound, away from all the chaos. Behind closed doors, I took off the mask and my gloves, and then I proceeded to spend most of the rest of the evening watching TV and reading in the comfort of my private chamber. Throughout the night, I could hear raucous sounds of partygoers having a great time while they celebrated the Yuletide. The feeling of anticipation was palpably building as the ultimate hour drew closer, and these joyful guests prepared to toast in the new year. We've always celebrated the holidays with this great group of friends, and this time I was stuck on the disabled list, unable to fully participate. Being alone at home for the chemotherapy recovery didn't really feel like a big deal, but sitting out most of the New Year's Eve festivities, that hit me pretty hard. With less than a minute to spare, I put on my protective gear, walked out to the balcony, and I looked down below upon the festivities. As that iconic ball made its final drop, sounds of elation rang out. I saw friends hugging friends and lovers kissing lovers, and I promised myself that next year things would be different, assuming I survived the cancer, that is. 2 weeks into the new year, it was time to visit the oncologist again, and Mom came along to show her support. When the oncologist asked how we were dealing with things at home, I confidently said we were doing fine, but my mom broke down crying. Fighting back tears, Mom talked about how hard it was for my daughter to understand what was happening to me. She didn't understand why I was sick and why she could not have any physical contact with me. Mom was carrying a lot on her shoulders. She had to worry about her son, who was facing a terminal illness, and her granddaughter, who was having trouble adjusting to this new life. She told the doctor how she was frustrated by her inability to improve the situation for those she loved, as was her natural instinct as a mother and grandmother. Regardless of how powerless she felt, I explained to Mom that she had already made a huge difference for me as a caregiver, and perhaps more than she could ever know. After wrapping things up, I thought a little bit more about what my mom was going through as we drove home. My mom was so incredibly important to me, and even though I was fighting for my life, I could not stand to see her in pain. I needed to figure out some way to settle things down at home so she could feel better. While I was thinking about a way to salve her pain, an important personal streak came to an end. So far, I had made it through 6 full weeks of chemotherapy without throwing up, but I was not able to hold out any longer. Quote, made it through 6 weeks of chemo without throwing up. Today was the day. January 18th, 2018, at Big Cheds. And actually, that was the only time I ever threw up in chemo. How about that? 2 cycles into my treatment, a major point of pride was not throwing up from chemotherapy. Even more, I had only experienced a tiny fraction of the side effects the doctors and nurses had so vigorously warned me about. Thanks to my use of CBD and THC medicines, I had been able to almost completely avoid using any of the pharmaceutical anti-nausea medications. And that's why I had been spared their side effects. Able to hold out no longer, the nausea got the best of me and sent me running to the toilet. I threw up and collapsed on the floor and then wiped the sweat off my forehead before taking a deep breath. Then, once I was able to gather up enough composure, I picked myself up off the floor and had a long stare down with the mirror before stumbling back to bed. As I laid in bed with my eyes closed, I tried to recenter myself so I could understand the gravity of the moment. Perhaps it was time to admit that I was not as strong as I had initially thought. Throwing up told me that I was not invincible. Despite having great medical care and top-notch medical marijuana, I would still have to deal with some of the worst side effects of chemotherapy treatment. Despite the challenges before me on a daily basis, I still tried to look for the positive in every situation. That bright side approach has always been a defining feature of my personality. This was even true when I got diagnosed with cancer. I noted that the chemotherapy and subsequent recovery period would be spent indoors, and that would allow me to avoid yet another brutal New England winter. My medical oncologist made sure we knew just how important it was for me to avoid going outside during the winter, due to my risk of getting sick with a compromised immune system. In fact, it was so important to keep me warm that I had to wear several layers of clothing just to get into the car. In New England, the winter is a period of time where you usually spend indoors anyway. You're usually indoors most of the time, but as crazy as it sounds, I really do enjoy shoveling snow. I find that it can be great exercise and has the added bonus of connecting with Mother Nature. However, due to my weakened immune system, I was unable to shovel and battle the elements as I do every other year. This winter, my wife and neighbors would have to pick up the slack. The area that I live in often has multiple massive snowstorms, one after another, so one must always be prepared for the worst that Mother Nature has to offer. To properly deal with these storms, we had a pretty decent-sized snowblower that I had used successfully the prior season and defeated each storm I faced. This year, I was riding the bench, unable to battle Mother Nature as I was battling another equally powerful foe, cancer. Even though I had strict orders from the doctor, I still wanted to battle the snow to see what I was made of. As foolish as that sounds. On Saturday afternoon of the second week of my third chemotherapy cycle, when my immune system was at its weakest, we had a brutal snowstorm and got hit with nearly 20 inches of snow. My neighbors knew that our family was at less than full strength, so when they finished their driveway, they came over to help with ours. Our neighbors had a much smaller area to clear and were able to shovel it by hand, whereas we had a huge driveway that we needed to use a snowblower to clear. My wife and these neighbors began their attempt to clear nearly 20 inches of snow from our driveway. Curious as to how they were doing, I pulled myself up out of bed and I moved over to the kitchen window where I saw them standing around the snowblower. They seemed to be studying it for a little while, and then one of them reached down and pulled the starter cord back. That didn't work, so they fiddled with a switch on the lower part of the machine and tried again, and still nothing happened. And then one of them primed the pump, moved the ignition switch to a different position, and again pulled the cord. But still, nothing happened. Leaving the group for a moment, my wife walked back inside to ask me for instructions. I explained to her the exact sequence they needed to follow to start the snowblower, and she returned to the group to try again. Even though I really wanted to test my strength, in my absolutely feeble state, I dared not even think about going outside to try to help them. As instructed by the doctor, I was to closely watch my temperature. Now, closing in on the end of the most vulnerable phase of my chemotherapy recovery cycle, avoiding getting sick over the next few days was the most important thing. If I could do that, I would most likely be home free and able to continue on to the next chemotherapy cycle with some good momentum, rather than ending up in the hospital again. Every treatment cycle that I could avoid going to the ER was a good one in my view. And with that in mind, I watched this group closely, eager to see if they were able to put my instructions to good use. With disbelief, dismay, and disappointment, I watched this group of able-bodied, non-cancer afflicted adults once again fail to start the snowblower. My wife came back inside again to ask for suggestions, and I again explained to her how to start the machine. She tried one more time to execute my instructions, and like our neighbor, she too failed. I was stunned. Fighting for my life and suffering through chemotherapy treatment, these folks could not even let me stay in bed and be sick. 3 grown adults had proven unequal to the task of starting a snowblower. I mean, come on, right? After their failed final attempt, I said, screw it. And I realized that I had to risk my health just to get the job done. Back to the bedroom I went, and I put on warm clothes, and I eventually donned 5 layers of shirts and 4 layers of pants. If I had to go outside in the freezing cold, I was going to give myself at least some modicum of protection against the elements. To the horror of my wife and my neighbors, I stepped outside the front door and I plodded through nearly 2 feet of snow to reach that snowblower. Bending down to examine the machine, I flipped the switch to the proper spot, primed the engine, and pulled the cord, and voila! With a great sense of satisfaction, I passed off the now functioning snowblower to my neighbor, and I went back inside to my protective cave. After removing multiple layers of clothing, I checked my heart rate. A high reading of my heart rate was a possible early sign of a rising body temperature, and to my horror, it was near 150. Panic struck. I quickly laid down in bed and turned off the lights to calm my body down a little bit. Then I grabbed 2 thermometers that I had kept on my bedside table and I checked my temperature to see if it was as high as my heart rate suggested. The first thermometer registered an elevated temperature of 100.1, and the second one, roughly the same result of 100.2 degrees. Now I was really freaking out, as before going outside, my temperature was right about 98. The magic number that obligated me to call the doctor and potentially head into the hospital was 100.4, and I was dangerously close to that number. Mercifully, thankfully, after an hour of laying down with a cold compress in my forehead, my temperature returned to normal and my panic subsided. My wife and neighbors eventually completed the back-breaking work of cleaning out that large driveway, and we dodged a bullet. There would be no trip to the emergency room that day. After the snowblower incident, things went rather smoothly for a while. Then, one day, during the end of that third cycle, after checking my temperature, I noticed that it had started to tick back up again. As I normally do, I also checked my heart rate, and that too was elevated. Seeing both my temperature and heart rate so high caused me to panic, as I was desperate to keep them down so I could avoid going back to the emergency room. To help calm myself down, I turned off the lights, put on some soothing music, and tried to sleep in the hopes that everything could return to normal. After an hour of tossing around, I checked my temperature again, and to my dismay, it was rising. In response, I tried a cold compress, and when that didn't work, I tried some meditation and yoga, hoping that I could calm my body down enough through sheer will alone. As the minutes wore on and those methods also failed, my temperature climbed back up over that magic number that required me to call the doctor. As was the case the last time I called the hospital, the nurse practitioner sent me to the emergency room out of an abundance of caution. Instructions received, I packed my bags for several days and left the house with my wife, emotionally prepared for another frustrating hospital admission. During this process, I kept my Twitter followers in the loop. Quote, trying everything I can to keep my temperature down so I do not have to spend a few days in the hospital. Laying in bed right now so I cannot respond to your chart requests. January 26th, 2018 at Big Cheds. Quote, heading to the ER, spiking a fever and will likely be in the hospital for a few days. January 26th, 2018 at Big Cheds. Quote, running tests now, fever is 102.2. Anything over 100.4, I go to the ER. January 26th, 2018 at Big Cheds. Instead of driving all the way into the city, this time we decided to head to a hospital that was much closer to home. Once we arrived, my wife dropped me off at the curb and went to park the car while I checked in with the front desk. After giving my name, I explained that my immune system was compromised and I had spiked a fever. I also mentioned that my oncology team feared that I may be neutropenic, and that was why I had been sent to the hospital in the first place. After entering my information into the system, we were placed into a small examination room where the nurse took my vital signs while they waited to free up a room. My temperature came in at 102.2, and I gave my wife this blank look. Never having my temperature get that high before, I was terrified, and I wondered what on earth was going on with my body. Was it some invisible germ that had attacked me, or was this some delayed effect from the snowblower incident a few days prior? Having spent so much time being afraid of getting sick, it seemed like those fears were justified. The nurse escorted me to a private room in the emergency room, and on the way there, I was again struck by all the people in pain and discomfort. Even though I had a serious medical issue, I was still able to count my blessings, knowing that others were perhaps facing even more difficult battles. The doctor on call ordered a wide array of tests, including an x ray, flu swabs, and blood tests to determine if I was indeed neutropenic. As I sat there waiting for the results, I felt myself becoming depressed again. The freedom I cherished so dearly suddenly seemed to be in real jeopardy. Excuse me. I was yearning to lay in bed at home and to rest, but this terrible disease kept me at a constant risk of getting sick. We continued to wait for about an hour, and then the first wave of test results came back. The flu swabs were negative, and the x ray showed no signs of pneumonia. The doctors could not figure out what was wrong with me, other than to say I had influenza like symptoms. After another hour or so of waiting and many more moments of terrible emotional distress, the blood test results finally came back. As luck would have it, my blood counts were high enough to let me stay at home rather than forcing the doctors to admit me to the hospital. Most importantly, I was not neutropenic. And that was a huge emotional victory. This news meant that I would be able to retain my freedom and rest at home where I was most comfortable. Coming out on the right end of this extremely close call gave me a lot of hope and reminded me not to give up so easily as I had before heading to the hospital hours earlier. Next chapter will be halfway home. This was Bumps in the Road, my battles with cancer. This is my cancer memoir, cancer patient and caregiver, stage 3 lymphoma. I published my memoir back in 2020 as a way to help people and help myself, just writing about it. And after publishing 2 more books, Trading Wisdom and Trading Quotes, I went back and I rewrote my battles with cancer. And then I spent the last 10 months or so recording the audiobook. So if you're enjoying this, you can get it an audiobook, when you're driving around and listen to it that way. But I want the book to be free. I want everyone to be able to get access to it. So that's why I'm recording this. I'm, of course, Big Cheds on Twitter, and I'm Cheds Trading on YouTube, where you're watching this right now. So I hope you are enjoying this video series, and I will continue with a new video soon. So, folks, thank you so much and take care.